Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. Welcome to the Kelly Writers House. I hope you all have good plates of food because we're ready to go. We're really excited to have Mara Hvistendahl here. She's an award-winning writer, journalist, and specialized in this intersection between science, culture, and policy. So we had fun trying to figure out all the different places around campus we could advertise to. And of course, it was a broad list. We emailed people in the sciences. We emailed people in political science. We emailed gender studies folks. We emailed our nonfiction lists. I mean, we really felt like this book called Unnatural Selection, Choosing Boys Over Girls and the Consequences of a World Full of Men, really touches a lot of important topics in a university, but also in our world. So this book just came out this summer, and it shows what that intersection of science, culture, and policy might produce. It's a compelling book. I haven't finished it, but I'm up reading it every night. It's gripping. It's gripping like a novel. It's gripping like science fiction. It's gripping like a horror film, but it's real, and that's a fantastic thing for a piece of journalism to do. Much of the book unfolds through carefully researched personal narratives about people who are touched by sex-selective abortion. So this means scientists, parents, demographers, sex workers. As one reviewer put it, Hvistendahl writes in a colorfully anecdotal style, showing her reader that the subject of demography is far from dry and dusty. It's like a juggernaut gathering up history, science, geopolitics, biology, anthropology, sociology, and economics into itself as it hurls forward into the future. You know, we have enough seats. There are a couple up here. Jess, do you want to sit up here? Okay. Unnatural Selection, I think, also tells a bigger story about how culture works, or how cultures work, particularly by considering some common misconceptions about the cultural origins of selective abortion. It's a complicated story. It's not an obvious story. We think we know the story, and we, in fact, don't know the story. This book demonstrates what deep, long research will reveal. So this is a thoroughly historical book. It's complex. It hits lots of buttons that are interesting to a campus and to the world. We have copies of it here, which you are welcome to purchase after this talk with Mara. What we're going to do is she'll tell us a little bit more about the book. She'll read from it, and then open the floor for your questions. And I hope you'll have many. I'll have this chord list so that we can have it floating around during the discussion portion, and that's less so that you can hear each other, and more so that it can be on a recording, so that it's a permanent archival thing. And we can talk about that after. If anything you say is not for the world, we know we don't have to post it. But so please help me welcome Mara Hvistendahl.
Well, thanks for having me. It's good to be here. I actually took a course in this room. I went to Swarthmore, not to UPenn, but I took the documentary writing class with Paul Hendrickson. It was a great course, and so it's really nice to be back here. Okay. Yeah, sure. So, great to be back here in this room. I'll talk a little bit about my book, about how I got the idea for it, how I went about reporting it, and broadly about this issue of sex selection, some of the effects of it, and then I'll read from the book as well, because demography can be really dry and it can be very abstract, and I actually tried to tell the story through individual people and through narrative sketches of people I met in the process of my reporting. So I'd like to show you some of that as well. So I was working as a journalist in China for several years when I started looking into sex selection. It's an issue that it crops up in the news again and again, and basically any time a new survey comes out, the census every 5 years there's a 1% sample survey, and so these numbers are published in the paper, and they keep going up. In 2000, it was 117 boys for every 100 girls born. This year, it's 118 boys per 100 girls. And in parts of the country, it's even more stark. There are these sort of danger zones where you find close to, in some cases, 160 boys per 100 girls. I started doing my reporting by going to a county in northern Jiangsu province called Suining, and the sex ratio of birth there had reached nearly 3 to 2. So it's a huge gap. But when in the papers, I mean, this appears in the Chinese press and the foreign press. In the papers, there's not generally so much context given. I find, like, I would see these numbers, and you can see the fact that there are many more boys born, particularly if you go to areas like northern Jiangsu province. But the question of why was one that I, even after several years in China, did not understand, and I didn't see any reporting that was really explaining it for me. The explanation that's typically given in the foreign press is that the one-child policy puts pressure on women, that the fact that they can only have one, and in many cases 2 children, kind of raises the stakes for each birth. And so then they turn to ultrasound and to abortion to make sure that one of those kids is a son. But the one-child policy's been in place since 1980, and the sex ratio really began to spike beginning in the 1990s. And then it's not so well enforced today. It's not as enforced as it was. In some cases, it's much more irrelevant for people. Many people would choose to have one child. I mean, we know this from looking at surveys. So the question in my mind was then, well, why is this happening now? And then at the same time, you have similar trends in other countries. So not just China, also India, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, and then moving beyond Asia to the Caucasus countries, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, and even into Albania, into the Balkans. So I set out to go to many of these countries. I went to 9 countries in all, to kind of put together a story as best I could of what was going on. I could say today that there are 2 big misconceptions that I found about sex selection. I think the first is that it's something that's happening among poor families in rural villages, and that's I think that exists to some degree because it's easy for reporters to go to those areas. It's easy to go to rural areas and talk to women in Indian villages, for example, about how badly they want a son. But when we look at the numbers, at where sex ratios are actually skewing, it's more in urban areas, and it's more in wealthier, middle-class areas. And that's true across Asia. That's true now in Eastern Europe, in Caucasus countries, that this is something that starts with the middle and upper classes and starts with more educated people and kind of works its way down from there. I think that's difficult. That's a more complex story than telling the story of rural women in villages doing something out of poverty or out of tradition. It means that this is more of a modern problem, that it's something that's cropped up in spite of development, in spite of higher rates of education among women. And I actually think it coincides with trends here in the US. I also talked about sex selection, which happens during in vitro fertilization here in the US. And a lot of the technology was in fact, a lot of the technology that's used for sex selection today, not just ultrasound, but IVF, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which is it's when you get to the embryo stage and you can withdraw a cell from an embryo and screen that for sex. That's pioneered in the U.S. So the second big misconception, I think, is that that sex selection's an Asian problem, that it's something that kind of connects to local traditions and is therefore confined to this region of the world. That isn't true, first of all, and then we see it happening in the Caucasus countries. But second, I found when I looked back, I wanted to look back at the history of sex selection technologies and get into really how these were developed and how they found their way from the U.S. to Asia. And I found that there was a link to the population control movement here in the 1960s. This is a long story that I probably don't have enough time to tell here, but there was a very active campaign in the U.S. And across the West in the 60s to control birth rates in the developing world. Many of you may remember or know that at the time population growth was an issue of major concern. This was a thing that it was almost like climate change today. There were very real reasons for caring about it, but it was so front and center that all kinds of strategies were put on the table. And one of the strategies that I found that was actually put forth at the time was to guarantee people a way to have the sex of a child of the sex of their choice. And I mean, this was something that was discussed at the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. There were seminars held on it in the late 1960s. People knew it would lead to more boys being born. There was no debate over that. The reason, in fact, was that the reason for proposing sex selection was that people continued to have children until they had a son. So the idea was then, let's guarantee them a son in the first or second try. So when I started reporting the book, these were all unexpected threads. I didn't expect to find them. I did go into the process with some idea of wanting to bring this kind of foreign issue home for Americans. I didn't want it to come across as a distant issue that crops up in the news that has no connection to people's lives here. I think when something is just viewed as in something that happens overseas, it's something that's very localized, it can be easy to dismiss. So I wanted to make it relevant, but these different threads, the fact that, first of all, that sex selection is actually a byproduct of development, and that second, it's something that the West played a role in bringing to the developing world. These were unexpected threads for me, and became a very important part of this story. And then I also spent some time talking about some of the effects. So today there are 160 million women missing from the population in Asia, huge gap, more than the female population of the United States. Most of these missing women, it's very difficult to talk about theoretical people, but they're not. They would be young still, so they would be girls, and the boys who exist without female counterparts. Demographers actually call them surplus men. It's a bit crass, but that's the term. They're still young too. But sex selection's been happening since the 1980s, so they are kind of coming of age now, and that is causing a lot of problems. There's a lot of men who can't find wives if they want them. There's been an increase in buying of brides, trafficking of women, there's a really flourishing trade already in women who are bought from Vietnam as brides and end up in wealthier countries like Taiwan and South Korea, and that has picked up. The U.S. State Department report on trafficking in persons, which just came out in June, also names the sex ratio imbalance as a cause of trafficking in and around the region. So huge effects as a result of sex selection. And to some degree, it's also difficult to predict what will come because we've never had a sex ratio imbalance on this level. These surplus men will reach maturity. I mean, most of them will hit maturity in the 2020s. And at that point, 15% of Chinese men will not have a female counterpart, 15% of men in Northwest India. So huge effects. I mean, I think first and foremost, it's an issue for women who, in these areas who are then more at risk of being bought, of being trafficked. But it's also an issue for society as a whole. And it's something I hope we can talk about as kind of global citizens, because today what's happening is selecting for boys, but I think on a broader level we need to address whether selection itself is something we want to allow in reproduction. So after traveling, spending much of my time going around the developing world, talking to parents and talking to demographers and sociologists, talking to, couldn't say that they're surplus men, but talking to men, talking to women. I also went to fertility clinics in LA and talked to the doctors who are making sex selection during IVF available, about what's next. Sex is now the first non-medical quality or non-disability trait that we can select for, I don't want to speculate too far about designer babies, but it could be someday we can select for eye color, hair color. What do we want to allow, and what don't we allow? I think what the discussions that went around population control in the 60s, what people foresaw then was that we were moving into an era when parents would want more control over reproduction and they would exercise more control. And that's something that's happened both in the West and in the East. So if in the 60s was an era of more state control, of kind of top-down policies and looking at abstracting people into numbers. So today we're at a point where individual parents are making these decisions, and they have the power, they have the ability to change the outcome of reproduction. And when you add up all those decisions, you get a very big problem. So that's kind of my book in a nutshell, but I probably am not doing it justice. Thinking maybe I can read to you from a passage that it comes out of a few days I spent with a couple in Taiwan. He is you'll get to know them, I think, as I read. But he's a kind of man who sought a wife in Vietnam, and so this is about their relationship. And let's see, can you all hear me? By the way, okay, just checking. Okay. This is from a chapter called The Bride. Cheng Qing Huang and Yuan Ti Mai Chao got engaged the same week they met. That was fast for both of them. But it couldn't have happened any other way. Chung had to catch a flight back to Taiwan, and Nguyen, who had been brought to Chung's Ho Chi Minh City hotel by an acquaintance who dabbled in matchmaking, was awaited in her village, where it would have been better not to return than to return unattached. There was no time for courtship. And had there been time, romance probably would have eluded them. They didn't speak the same language, and they had little in common. Chung had grown up in Taiwan during an era of prosperity. A simple man, a fruit farmer, he was nonetheless educated, keenly interested in the world outside his village, and relatively well off at age 31. A quality outwardly evident in his fleshy, generously nourished physique. Nguyen was Vietnamese, 20, and petite. The 9th of 10 children in a poor family from rural Vinh Long province, she left school at 14 to work as a maid. Few qualities bound her and Chung. And in their cases, opposites most definitely did not attract. When she first laid eyes on Chung, Nguyen thought, "He's so fat." Chung, meanwhile, fixated on the fact that the woman before him looked like a scared girl. He worried he'd have to teach her everything about life. He asked for a hand in marriage anyway. A few years earlier, Chung had resigned himself to the idea that he would never marry. His older brother, who farmed the family plot in the hills outside Taichung with him, had remained a bachelor, as had many men of his age throughout Taiwan who had the bad luck of being born at a time when Taiwanese were aborting female fetuses by the thousands. All told, Chung's generation had nearly 750,000 more men than women. A substantial gap in a country with only a few million working-age adults. To make matters worse, gender roles had changed. Not only were Taiwanese women scarce, but they chased jobs rather than family now, fleeing rural areas after high school for cities like Taipei in search of university degrees and good careers. Chung knew it had become difficult to convince a modern Taiwanese woman to live on a farm. Then his sister suggested he find a wife in Vietnam. Vietnamese women willing to wed strange men they had never left and move to strange lands they had never visited tended to come from remote villages in the Mekong Delta, reachable only by boat. Their parents expected money in exchange for their daughters, and the negotiation process could prove complicated. But by 1999, when Chung first looked into it, enough Taiwanese men had already married Vietnamese women, or Vietnamese villagers, that networks had sprouted, with the wives who arrived first serving as matchmakers for their husbands' single friends. A few enterprising women had started agencies that simplified the process by offering all-inclusive trips to Vietnam. For a mere $10,000, a man could buy a flight to Ho Chi Minh City, hotel, meals, transportation, and a wife. Chung decided to give it a try. Marriage had only recently occurred to Nguyen, too, who thought she had a few more years of single life ahead of her. After the maid job didn't last, she spent several years jumping from one profession to the next, working at a shoe factory, assembling high heels, and later at a coffee shop near Ho Chi Minh City, always sending some of her earnings to her family. She was at the coffee shop when her mother sent word that she was sick, summoning Nguyen back to their village. When the young woman arrived, she found her mother in fine health, but with the mind fixated on one thing. It was time for her youngest daughter to really help the family. Win knew what that meant. A few women in her village had married Taiwanese men, and the money and gifts those marriages had brought in raised their family's standing and wealth to such a degree that locals had taken to talking about the Taiwanese dream. Beyond that, everything got a little hazy, though. Win had no idea what life in Taiwan was like. She knew the names of only a few of the countries outside Vietnam's borders, and her encounters with Taiwanese men extended to a few barked comments from her boss at the shoe factory. But she was an obedient daughter, and she agreed to her mother's plan. The next thing she knew, she was at a dreary Ho Chi Minh City airport hotel, clutching the bouquet of flowers the matchmaker had instructed her to buy. She wondered why she should be the one to buy flowers, but was too shy to ask, as she waited with other women for an evening flight from Taipei to land. Finally, the men arrived. The matchmaker introduced the couple, and then Win stood before Chung silently, her eyes averted, and waited. "So?" the matchmaker asked him after he'd had a few minutes to stare. "Will you marry her?" Okay, that's it.
So, as I promised, there's time for questions. I have several, but I thought I'd first open it up to all of you. Okay.
Did you ask people why they wanted children of one sex and not another? Can you tell us some of the reasons? I mean, the major reasons?
Yes. Well, you know what? I didn't actually spend a lot of time going into the reasons because they differ from one country to the next. And for me, the important thing was that there is this preference for boys in many parts of the world. I think actually not that long ago in the US, surveys, we didn't select for boys, and we didn't have the capacity to select for boys 20 or 30 years ago, but surveys showed that Americans wanted their firstborn child to be a boy. And I mean, in my own family, if you look at my grandmother's generation, there's definitely a preference for sons. But the reasons vary. I mean, for me, the discussion was more about the technology and about the fact that we have this capacity to select for what child we want.
Change it, you have to know why. You know, you have to attack it at the root, which is why people want boys and not girls.
Well, I would argue that you could say that that's the root. You could say also that if the technology weren't there, if the technology did not enable people to select, that they wouldn't be able to do it. So for me, this was the interesting thing to focus on.
I have a follow-up question to that. What were these conversations like with people? Were these easy conversations to have? Did you have to explain your project? Were these difficult subjects, or because it was on a demographic focus, was it a different entry into issues that are for some people challenging?
It is a difficult thing to talk to people about, definitely. To some degree, sex selection has become so common in some areas that it's so pervasive that people now just talk about it. They may not talk about their own family, but they certainly talk about what the neighbors are doing, what the what the effects on the community will be. In Suining, in this county in Jiangsu province, where I spent a few weeks talking. This was the place with the sex ratio at birth of 3 to 2. The local government channel was running specials on the sex ratio imbalance and about how there wouldn't be enough brides in 30 years, and people were talking about this. So, I mean, to get people to talk about their own decisions, that was something that came out over time, and with trust, and I think like any issue. But at least in China, the sex ratio imbalance used to be considered sensitive, and it used to be difficult to get even family planning officials to talk about it, demographers, and it's not anymore. It's now something that the government's very much talking about. So that helped. And then in India, it is something that activists have been trying to get people to pay attention to for years. It's very the gender balance is very much talked about.
Hi, is the absence of women in these provinces changing the role of men there? Are they having to assume jobs and perform tasks that would have been done by women?
That's something that hasn't been looked at so much. There has been speculation on what the effects will be for certain, like there will be more demand for domestic labor, for jobs that women are traditionally performing. I think so far sex selection is something that's happened in the wealthier areas, in the more developed areas, and those are also the people who now can afford to bring in women, unfortunately. So I think so far the effects have been a bit diffused. In rural areas, I would say that's where it's felt most strongly, and that's where men really have trouble getting married, where they can't buy a woman there. And eventually I would say that there would be effects, but it's something that people haven't talked about or looked at so much.
Hi. Looking at the situation economically through the lens of the laws of supply and demand, one would gather that as women became rarer, their value would increase. However, what I'm gathering from what you said about trafficking, that doesn't seem to be the case, that trafficking is increasing, rapes are increasing, and the degradation of women as well. So why isn't economics operating here? Do you have any idea about that?
Well, there have been, particularly economists who've suggested that this is supply and demand rules work in this case. I mean, I think Gary Becker, the Nobel Prize winner, has been he's been interested in the sex ratio imbalance, and I think just as recently as 2009, he wrote about how this will eventually all even out because people will just begin to value girls more. I think in a crude way that supply and demand logic does apply, in that the value of women has gone up, but that they aren't controlling their own value. The other people are controlling it. So they cost more, but people can buy or sell them now. Their parents can sell them. And so that's one really unfortunate effect. This is also happening at the same time as there have been many advances for women, particularly in urban areas in Asia. So it's not that all women are going to be oppressed as a result of sex selection. There's certainly more and more women getting PhDs, getting professional careers, and for women in urban areas, they may not feel the effects, but there is this group of poor, disadvantaged women who are more at risk.
I was actually just talking about this very topic with my mother, and my mother, she was born in India, and she has a lot of speculation, and she says that a lot of people in India would rather have a son because they would pass down the name of the family, because women wouldn't, because traditionally they take on the man's name. And she also said about the fact that there's more men than women, this is her speculation, said that men will actually tend to like men more because there's more companionship there. And she thinks that there'll be a huge gay culture emerging in India, and now that things are more like urbanized and westernized, and there's an acceptance there, that it'd be okay to be like gay there. And she thinks that's kind of a good thing, but that's part of the thing. So the lack of brides may not be such a like a bad thing. And I think it's, again, urban area type of thing. So
I do think well, I don't. GLBT groups in China, at least, are interested in the gender imbalance. I heard a Chinese demographer who I interviewed told me she was kind of like, I think she's in her 70s, and she told me she was being approached by GLBT groups about talking about the sex ratio imbalance and the effects it will have. I think for men who are pressured into getting married, who feel a lot of family pressure to get married, who maybe don't want to be with a woman, that this would be a good thing. There would be less pressure. On the other hand, for lesbian women, there may be more pressure to get married. Certainly will be effects. There will be all kinds of effects in how people marry, how people adapt. Right now, very large percentage of men in Asia get married, and may just become more acceptable to be a bachelor.
I have a straight up career question. I know there are lots of Paul Hendrickson students here. How do you go from a student in Paul's class to your first book? I don't mean necessarily what's the path for any of these students to take, but what were the important decisions in your career? How do you conceive of a large project and get there? It's a big question. So it's really what writing advice do you have for the students who are here?
Well, I remember I went on to Columbia Journalism School right after graduating, and I took a class on writing a book proposal and had an idea for a book I wanted to write. And I remember meeting with Paul, or calling him. I think I met with him for coffee and telling him I want to write a book. And and I remember him saying, Don't write a book now. Like, wait until you really have an idea that you love and that you really have together, and then write a book. And that was good advice. I was a bit maybe overeager, but one piece of advice other writers have given me is, if you are going to write a book, make sure it's something you're really passionate about and want to talk about for years, want to think about from every different angle. But definitely the documentary class was good preparation, and just learning how to spend time around people, observing and picking out details, and then how to put those together into a narrative.
Okay, so I have two quick things. One, so what is it that made you so passionate about these issues in the first place, that made you do this for so many years? And second, what was your doc when you were in Paul Hendrickson's class?
It was just an issue. Well, I think at the time I started working in China, since then the number of foreign journalists has increased a lot. The range of reporting on China has increased. But I was just always been fascinated with issues that I can't explain readily, but where I look into them and it's not immediately clear what's going on. I felt the same way actually early on about nationalism in China. About there was I'm not sure what's going on with it now, but a kind of strong youth nationalist movement, and I wonder, well, why is that happening now? And so any question where the answer is just not readily available, that for me was captivating. But then the fact that there is also a fundamental human rights issue attached to this, and as a woman, I felt like it was something that I wanted to talk about. My doc was actually to go to. I spent a time volunteering at a nursing home in, I think it was in Springfield, and just I just followed actually one old woman there and talked to her and and told her story, she was a really powerful woman and kind of old Southern belle, and had a lot of time to tell stories, and I just really got to like her, and so that was it.
Could you tell us how you got to China? Did you have some kind of an assignment? Did you go on your own as some kind of a freelancer? And also, if you talk about your language skills, did you speak some Chinese before you got there? Did you work with a translator?
Sure. I grew up in my mother is a daughter of missionaries who worked in Asia, and when she divorced my father, she moved in with her Chinese friends. So I grew up with hearing Chinese. I didn't grow up speaking it, and I started studying it in high school. So I went already speaking pretty decently. I studied all through Swarthmore, and the language wasn't such an issue. And for me, when I went to other countries, then it was really I also went to Albania, went to South Korea. I tried to in Taiwan and even in Vietnam, I could do a bit of reporting using Chinese, but in other countries, I used translators. So.
Hi, Mara. Sunil Desai. Brilliant work. Putting aside for a second that we have surplus men even without this gender selection issue as already demonstrated. And you mentioned earlier that you don't think this problem is a traditional, it's modern. In India, certainly, the arranged marriages is a tradition. I don't know how it's in the rest of Asia, but what are your thoughts on that? That is a tradition, and that feeds into this, I think. And what do you see as the solution to both problems, I guess?
I'm afraid I haven't looked into arranged marriages enough to say much on them that would be intelligent. I do think there are traditional values at play here, definitely. But I think that the tradition element has been sort of overplayed or played up too much in explanations of why this gender imbalance has come about. I was actually as I was writing this, I was reading Philip Gorevich's book on Rwanda. It's a really long name. When we wish to inform you that tomorrow we will be killed with our families. And I know next to nothing about Africa, but I was really influenced by the fact that he took this issue that had been explained as an ethnic conflict stretching back into the ages, and as this the Hutus and Tutsis had always killed each other, had always clashed, and he unpacked that and showed, well, actually, this is to some degree a modern development, and that it's been reported wrong, and that, well, the Belgians played a significant role in Rwanda, for one. So I wasn't. It isn't that tradition doesn't have a role here, but I think that it had been played up a bit, and I wanted to show another part of the story.
You said that you thought that control of the technology would be the best way to control sex selection. Do you or your novel, do you take a stance on that then?
Not exactly. No, I'm afraid I don't have a solution for the world, for what's happening now. But I do think I take a bit of a stance on where international policy should go. This gets tied up into abortion politics, which we didn't even go into. But the position of the of the UN, to the extent that there's been a position, and of many international organizations, has been that this isn't about technology at all. This is about traditional values. We need to make women more valued. We need to increase opportunities for women and girls. Let's not focus on the technology at all. And I think that's in part because of the sensitivity about opening the door for restrictions on abortion. I think that certainly new technologies need to be addressed and maybe restricted before they're introduced. Like PGD, the sex selection that's performed during IVF, the U.S. has incredibly lenient regulations, or maybe not really any regulations on it. But you're in most of Western Europe, you're not allowed to select for sex during IVF. These things we need to regulate and consider as they go forward. And in China and India, both sex determination is illegal, and sex-selective abortion is illegal as well. And I'm going to go so far as to argue that's right. That's in these countries have said this is not something we want to allow, and parents want to know the sex of their baby, but that's something that we'll sacrifice in order for the greater good of increasing the number of girls that are born. And I do think we need to look at more restrictions, but I'm not sure exactly what they are in the case of what's happening now. Mm-hmm.
This is definitely a book worth reading. We have copies in the living room. I want to give one more round of applause for Mara Hvistendahl.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, thanks.